I've been rewiring the entertainment system for the last 3 hours. It hadn't been rewired in, well, years and years. All the wires that had been there from previous configurations were still there. It was a mess, and it was filthy, and dirt everywhere. So I thought, well, now I'd better bother. So I moved all the equipment to the other side of the TV, and I wired it all up, and this time I zip tied all the pieces together, and I color coded them, and I plugged it all in, and I turned it on, and of course I put in a Star Trek Blu-ray because, hey. And this is what I get. No signal. Now, maybe I've got some configuration to do. I'm not sure. But it's disheartening. And I don't know if I have the oomph to work on it tonight. We'll see. Not a happy camper today. I spent all evening last night rewiring the home entertainment center to fix the problem, which I'm just going to run this little diagrammy thing to remind you of what the problem was and how I diagnosed it. Going through the diagnostic process, this is what we have. Now, for starters, I have a TV up here. And it has multiple HDMI ports, but we just used ports 1 and 2. Then we have an AV receiver, which switches the inputs from various devices. And for the start of this, we'll go with two devices, a Blu-ray player, disc, and an Apple TV. Now, each of these devices is connected via an HDMI cable, and the AV receiver is in turn connected by an HDMI cable to the TV. That's our simple setup. 1. Data point. The TV, this is the problem, sometimes the TV turns on in black and white. And absolutely everything you send to it through the AV receiver is black and white, whether you switch between devices or whatever. And the only way to get it to come back to color is a series of cycles and resets between either the TV or the AV recorder. Now, remembering that if I turn off the AV receiver or turn off the TV, I'm resetting the data link on the HDMI between the two of them, so you are essentially resetting the subsystem and they renegotiate. So that doesn't really answer the question where the problem is. It just tells us that the problem occurs sometimes at startup on the system. So, first data point. When I come over here on the TV, and it's in black and white, like it's not supposed to be, and if I bring up the on-screen menus are in color, even though behind them, the picture is in black and white. Now that tells me that the TV screen is functioning and that the system is perfectly capable of understanding color, so it's not a loss there. It's just that it thinks what it's putting up on the screen is supposed to be in black and white. So, data point 1. Screen is okay. Now, we come in here and I'm going to add another device. Doesn't matter what the device is. I used a computer, but I've used other devices. And I connected that device via HDMI to port 2. the picture from that device is fine in color. You switch back to HDMI 1 input coming from the receiver, and the picture is black and white. So, it might be the port. So swapping the HDMI cable from the receiver to 2, and from this device to 1, results in, yep, you guessed it, the signal coming from this external device on port 1 is in color, but the signal coming from the AVR to port 2 is now in black and white. That eliminates the ports from this equation. It is not the ports. Let's hop over here to the other side. Well, so it's 2, not the ports. Hopping over here to the other side of the equation, the Blu-ray player and the Apple TV. It's difficult to believe that both the Blu-ray player and the Apple TV would both be malfunctioning in black and white at the same time. So we can kind of say that since it doesn't matter whether I switch the AV recorder from either device, we can kind of eliminate both of them from the equation. And we can therefore also eliminate their cables. It's not the input devices. And it's not the input devices' cables. But let's make 100% sure of that. Let's make 100% sure of that. So, we come over to the Apple TV, and we take a new cable, and we string it directly from we disconnect it from the AV recorder, we disconnect the TV from the AV receiver, and we connect the Apple TV direct to the TV in port 1. And the solution here is that it's in color. Plug the Apple TV back into the recorder without turning anything off. Plug the Apple TV back into the receiver. Stop calling it the recorder. And then plug the receiver back into the TV, and the picture is black and white. So definitely eliminating the Apple TV. Okay, finally, one last test. The cable that we use, the new cable, I ran directly from the ATV to the TV. I now insert as a replacement between the receiver and the TV. And the result is that the TV is still in black and white. That eliminates this HDMI cable from the equation. We have effectively eliminated the television, we have eliminated the devices, we've eliminated the Apple TV, we've eliminated everything, the cables, except the AV receiver. So, that would tell us that it pretty much has to be the AVR. But I've got one more piece of equation here that I did not tell you about because I didn't test it thoroughly because this test tells me it has to be the AVR. But here's the last remaining piece of this equation. I also have a Wii, which is connected to the receiver via component cable. So it's on completely different input. And it is connected to the TV on a different port on component video. So whereas all these others, we just change the AVR and it changes the input and the TV stays on the HDMI input, but to use the Wii, we have to actually switch to the component video. And guess what? That's black and white too. Part of the reason I've left that out of the equation is that the Wii has always been a little flaky when it comes to color holding the signal, so we didn't use it. But everything else diagnosed across the board, it's got to be the AVR. And in this case, the Wii does not connect directly to the television. The Wii connects to the AVR. And it still is black and white, which would mean that it is not the component cables. and it's again not the ports on the TV. It has to be the AVR. And that is how we have diagnosed that it must be the receiver. Okay, so that was, my logic behind it. I've been doing diagnostic of circuits, electrical, computers, things for a long time, and I'm pretty confident in that process. And yet, we still have a problem. But it wasn't just that. Part of the reason it's so damn frustrating is that it took hours and hours to rewire this thing. And part of the reason is because of cruft, if you will. I'm sure you've done this. Well, maybe you haven't, but you have something and then you make a change to it, and you make the change and you don't bother to necessarily clean up the leftovers. In this case, I had an old stereo receiver years and years ago. It's called years and years ago, that did not do AV. It was just a stereo. And then I had a TV, which was a much older TV than the one I've got here. Still a big screen, but... and then, I had a variety of devices. And over the years, I would add things, disc players, later on Blu-ray players, Apple TVs. And of course, they would be, increasingly becoming internet connected. Then I had an AV receiver put in, and the one that I just took out. And a lot of these things had to be connected to Ethernet. And so I had, Ethernet hubs and stuff plugging in. And then as time goes by, Ethernet has fallen out of favor in favor of wireless. And my devices have become wireless. And the cables were still there. And the old audio cables were still there. And stuff that had been removed, the equipment had been removed, but the cable had been left behind. And it was just a nightmare. And one of the changes that had been made over the years was, it used to be that over here is where the stereo equipment was, and the TV was still here. When I had the old TV, the inputs on the old TV were on this side. And so this all worked just fine. But when I put this TV in, the inputs are, of course, over on that side. So all this stuff was crossed over all the way across the TV, and the HDMI cables were pretty tight. They weren't bending or anything, but I mean, they weren't touching the floor from the receiver to the TV. And so part of what I did yesterday was I moved this cabinet to there and that cabinet to there, and so now all the AV equipment is here in that cabinet. And it was a nightmare. I mean, I've got cables here, and I've got piles of cables there, and I've got stuff. And of course, it was filthy, dirty. The robotic vacuum can't get back there. And I mean, it's just dust everywhere. And so it all had to come out, and it all had to be cleaned, and all the cables had been disconnected and moved around. And it was a nightmare. It was a freaking nightmare. And then turned on, and it was working, and did some switch around and turned it on, and I'll be goddamned if it wasn't black and white again. And I don't know what to make of that. I'm confident in my diagnostic procedure that I ruled out the TV, and ruled out the cables, and ruled out the secondary devices. And yet, I've still got the problem. It's almost inconceivable that I would have two AV receivers that are 15 years apart, two different manufacturers that have the same problem. Therefore, it has to be something to do with the TV. But how can that possibly be when it just didn't follow the TV, the problem, unless unless there's something different about the signal that comes out of this receiver than what comes out of the device directly. Does that make any sense? So the device is the output device, say the Apple TV, is sending a signal via HDMI that hits the receiver. The receiver is changing that signal in some way. Maybe not a defect, but something about the way it works. It's changing that signal, and then the signal is coming to the TV, and because it is a different signal, the TV, which is not able to interpret that correctly, is causing a problem. Now, that would be a problem with the TV, not the receiver, but that's incredibly hard to diagnose. And I'm really stretching. I'm really stretching for that. That solution to bypass all the other data I have. And I don't like doing that because that's not the way problems are. So I don't have another TV, but I do have a monitor. And I'm going to try hooking up the monitor and see what we get. But I'm not taking that receiver back. I like that receiver. I like it a lot better than the old one, which was really old. But I don't really want to buy a new TV either. And I don't think this TV should have died this quickly. I'm not sure how old it is, 10 years maybe, but I don't think it should have died in that length of time. But maybe I'm just old school. Damn it, I don't know how this failed. How was that diagnostic procedure possible to not work? This is so annoying. Fine. Time for a trip to Costco. Take a look at TVs.